All right. And we should be live now. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our third installment of Bitcoin for Everybody, um, uh, where we go through Saylor Academy's course of Bitcoin for Everyone. I will make sure that I put the links to that in the description. I'll put the discourse there as well if you guys would like to continue the conversation. Obviously, if you have questions watching live, leave them in the chat. If you have questions later, you can put them down in the comments, and we'll try and get back to them at a later time if that's okay. But before I do that, I just want to again tell everyone, if you haven't caught up, you can catch up on our other two videos we've done in the course that we're doing. So that's all I have to say, and I'll just hand it over to Stephan to like take it away here.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Mike. So for the listeners out there, hopefully you are enjoying your progress through the course on Bitcoin for Everybody. And so today we are talking through some of the material from Unit 3, which is about essentially Bitcoin history and philosophy, and some of the things that have happened, some of the things that happened before Bitcoin, as well as some of the things that have happened during Bitcoin's life, and a few key events. Now, joining me today is Aaron van Wirdum. He is a very well-known journalist in the Bitcoin space. He is the technical editor for Bitcoin magazine. And so for those of you, if you're new coming into the space and you're trying to learn about Bitcoin, and sometimes you're looking for articles and you're not sure if it's a good article or not, a good guy you can follow and you can read some of his stuff is Aaron's stuff. So make sure you go and check out some of his work. Obviously, we're going to be looking through and talking through some of that stuff now anyway. But Aaron, welcome. And why don't you tell the viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself and where you came from and what you're doing in this Bitcoin space.
Hey, Stefan. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm the technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine. I do a couple of podcasts. Well, one of them is in Dutch, so you'd have to be able to speak Dutch, which is called The Bitcoin Show. I also have a more technical podcast with Jos Provost, who's a Bitcoin core developer, which is called the Van Wirdum Shorznado. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So look, I think this is one of the things. Now, in some of the earlier material, we talked a little bit more about Bitcoin economics, Bitcoin investment. So today we're going to focus a little more on this idea of Bitcoin history and philosophy. So I think an important point that a lot of people don't really grasp is when they're new, they just think Bitcoin was this like, it was like this holy, it just kind of came out of nowhere, and it was the one-time invention that just did it all. Is that true, Aaron, or is there actually more to this story? What's going on here? What is that?
Yeah. There's a lot more to the story. So there was this group of privacy activists, technologists, cryptographers throughout the 90s called the Cypherpunks. And they were sort of on a mission to bring the tools of cryptography to the people. Like, cryptography was invented already. It existed. Started in the 70s with, that's public key cryptography. Sorry, we could go back even further, but that was a major breakthrough. But it wasn't really being applied in the real world yet. It wasn't in the hands of real people in order to be able to communicate privately or anything like that. While the internet was slowly becoming a thing. So then this group, mostly centered in the Bay Area in California, they wanted to bring these tools to the people. So that was public key cryptography, which we're all using now, in our chat apps if they're encrypted, for example. But they were also working on things like remailers, which were the sort of the predecessor of Tor. It works in a similar way. So it was a way to, email anonymously, email without letting the recipient know who you were, or without potential snoops on the network knowing who you were. They were working on these kinds of tools. And one of the things they were also, they wanted to realize was a digital cash system, a digital form of cash. Now, cash in this context meant something you can use privately. If you have a cash, if you have a dollar bill and you want to buy something from someone, you hand that person the dollar bill, you get the product in return. No one in the world needs to know that you actually handed over that dollar. While if we're switching to a digital payment system, people were talking about that sort of stuff in the 90s. Then all of a sudden you can have a PayPal, for example, or a payment processor, which is keeping track exactly of who's paying who, when, potentially how much everyone owns, and these kinds of things. So the Cypherpunks wanted to create a digital cash system. Now, there was already a digital cash system in development in Amsterdam, actually, by David Chaum. He was an early cryptographer, and he used some of the tools of public key cryptography to come up with a centralized digital cash system. And then the Cypherpunks, well, at first they were very hopeful about that, but it wasn't really getting off the ground. And Chaum, there were issues with patents, and that it wasn't really working out. So the Cypherpunks started to think of alternative ways of doing digital cash.
Excellent. And so if we were to dive a little further into who these people were and what their motivations were, I think it's probably fair to say there was a range of ideologies and thought around this. Like, they weren't all just the same kind of person, but it's probably fair to say, generally speaking, they saw technology as a liberating force, and they saw it as a way to give people back some privacy, but also enable them to do things like to communicate or to trade. So Aaron, do you want to just spell out some of your research and your thinking on who these people were? What was their motivation? What were they interested in? What were they trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I would say there were sort of the more radical cypherpunks and the more moderate cypherpunks in a way. So the more moderate cypherpunks, they care about privacy more in a human rights type of perspective. You require privacy to be yourself in all sorts of ways, and that's how you can live in a free society. There's also, good reasons that elections are done in an anonymous way without needing to reveal who you voted for. You could argue, for example, if you want to donate to a political party, you might not want the world to know that you donated to that political party, for example, because an alternative party might win. And if that's a fascist party, then you could get in trouble 10 years later. I'm just giving an example from the top of my head. But there are all sorts of very good, very reasonable reasons to have privacy. Now, there was also a more radical branch of the cypherpunks, which was led by Tim May, for example, and he saw privacy tools as something that could enable a bigger vision for the future of the world, namely something he calls crypto anarchy. Crypto anarchy meant in that vision of the world, people would basically free themselves from government control over their lives more or less entirely. One obvious way he envisioned was, if we have digital cash, then we can hide our incomes, we can hide our our money, we never need to tell the government any of that, and that means the government can't tax us. Another example would be, he envisioned this idea called Blacknet. I hope I'm saying it right. I think it was called Blacknet. I'm pretty sure it was Blacknet. This was an information market. So keep in mind, this is like early 90s. This was way before eBay, way before any sort of market existed on the internet at all. And he came up, so a friend of his came up with the idea of an information market. His name was George Salgin. Am I saying that right? I have trouble with
Selgin,
names.
yeah.
Selgin, right? Yeah. So he came up with that idea for information market, so people could buy and sell any type of information. So he saw that as a sort of solution to the cost of transactions. And the cost of transactions in that context meant in the broad sense of the word. So, for example, if you're buying a car, then the cost of transaction isn't just the cost of sending the money to the car dealer, but it's also, for example, doing the research of finding out where you get the best deal. It's also, maybe the time it costs you to get to that dealership, and all these kinds of things. Now, he saw an information market as a solution for these kinds of problems, because you could, for example, ask someone online, where do I get the best deal for this type of car I want? And then someone else would actually go and look that up. You'd pay that person $5 over the internet, and you'd save yourself a bunch of money and cost you'd have researching and all that. Now, Tim A thought that idea was very interesting, but he came up with a more radical version of that, which was selling mainly secret information, for example. So you could have leaks within a government agency selling secret information to another government, or within the company secret, someone who'd leak that information in return for money to competing companies. And Tim A saw this as something that could really undermine governments, militaries, huge big corporations, everything. So evading tax, destroying secrets in this way, and that's how he saw the internet and cryptography and these kinds of tools really change the world. He called that crypto anarchy.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think, there you go.
I have, he wrote the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. I have a poster of that behind me. It's a
nice.
printed version of the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto is an interesting read. And I think part of the reason some of this material is here in the course is just to give people an awareness of where did this come from, and also just an understanding of who these people were and what they were trying to achieve. How did the Cypherpunks collaborate and go about things? I know there was a mailing list, for example.
Yeah, so they started out in the Bay Area mostly. So the internet was upcoming, and hacker culture was a thing there as well. And Tim May and Eric Hughes and a couple of other people, they knew each other from other subcultures. I already mentioned the hacker subculture, but also the Extropians, for example, which was a very futurist subculture. And they came together, and the first time they met, in someone's apartment, in Eric Hughes' apartment. From there, it started growing. So at some point, they established a mailing list for what, again, this wasn't a very common thing in the early 90s, a mailing list. There was new stuff. They started a mailing list for one, to coordinate meetings, and then also to sort of continue the discussion after the meetings, or to keep in contact with each other. And that mailing list actually became somewhat of an early internet phenomenon. At some point, it was covered by Wired, and that attracted a whole new bunch of attention, and people from all around the world started to read the mailing list and contribute. And at one point, there were Silicon Valley CEOs on there, and so that became a small phenomenon, and that became something that early internet users could find and learn about these ideas and these concepts and these technologies that these people were building.
And the Cypherpunks have a saying, and this is even the title of the series. It's called Cypherpunks Write Code. So what does that mean, Aaron?
Yeah, so that kind of comes from the hacker subculture, I guess. It means that to enact change in the world, you don't go and lobby politicians. You don't go and ask for permission. What you do is you actually write the code and distribute it to people, in people's hands, for them to use. In general, they used, it was free software in general, which was also, another sort of subculture technologist movement where nowadays it's better known as the open source movement. So they're slightly different things, but it's a bit off topic to maybe get into all of that. But yeah, the idea was writing code, distributing it. That's how you make change in the world.
Yeah, so it's interesting that there was that focus, and if you will, it strikes me as a bit more, it's a group of people who are trying to some of them are being academic and theoretical about what might exist in the future, but then on the other hand, some of them are very pragmatic. They're just thinking, hey, I've come up with this idea, and here's some code that will achieve this idea. And that also, I think, reflects through into the way there's a famous quote by Satoshi. It's something like, I had to write all the code to make sure that I could do it before I released the white paper. And that's also, you can sort of see that from Satoshi's writings, right?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I will note it's not necessarily confirmed that Satoshi was himself, in fact, a cypherpunk. Although there's a, there's a good reason to believe that he was. He obviously knew why something like pseudonymity was important, and he was clearly familiar, at least, with some of these technologies that cypherpunks were also working on. But it's not obvious that he was necessarily a cypherpunk. But that's up to the speculators. That's up to the
Yeah,
that's part of the guessing game of who Satoshi was.
Yeah, it's I think it's sort of looking at what were his likely influences. Maybe that's the way to put it. And there's also another interesting topic, which is that whole crypto wars, right? So in the 90s, there was this whole debacle around, Clipper technology and what was the government going to do about it, and should cryptography be viewed as this munitions grade technology? What were the crypto wars?
Yeah, so cryptography, I just mentioned public key cryptography, which was invented in the 70s. In the 90s, and this started when Bill Clinton came into office. They basically started the crypto wars, you could say. Now, the thing is, cryptography used to be a thing which was a military tool, basically. It were military people that were using these kinds of things. It wasn't something that the regular Joe would use for anything. Usually, it was something for the military. So therefore, I assume it's because of that. It was also classified. No, not classified. I'm trying to think of the right word. Seen as ammunition. Yeah. So it was illegal to export it, for example. That was the most important one. And that became very iffy because now you have the internet. And Phil Zimmerman, who was working on PGP, which was an implementation of public key cryptography, he was now being targeted by the government because he put his software online, and that was seen as a form of exporting it. You also mentioned the Clipper chip. Yeah, that was a chip that the government wanted phone providers to put into phones. It was supposed to offer encrypted communication with whomever you were calling, but it was also wiretappable by the government whenever they felt like it. So yeah, the cypherpunks really didn't like this idea. In their minds, privacy was not only a human right, but it was also important that you actually have that right in the worst case scenarios, which is that a scenario where the government itself becomes corrupted. That's when you need it the most. So you can't have backdoors in cryptography, because at the time you'd need it the most, then it could still be abused. So they start to basically fight back. It wasn't just the cypherpunks. It was, also more regular human rights groups and journalists, were covering it. And it was a broader topic than just the cypherpunks, but the cypherpunks considered themselves sort of the activist wing of this movement. So yeah, they were holding contests to break cryptography, for example. They were coming up with innovative new solutions to make it more obvious why these export regulations were so ridiculous. For example, Adam Back, he had the cryptographic protocols printed on a T-shirt. So that meant you couldn't cross the border with that T-shirt on, because now you'd be a weapons or ammunition exporter. officially. The same the PGP was also printed in a book to make it obvious that this is just information, this is just data, and if we are free to publish books, then why aren't we free to publish software? It's basically the same thing. What else? Yeah, they were doing all these kinds of activist stunts, and also real breakthroughs. One of the cypherpunks broke the security of the Clipper chip. So I think it was the Clipper chip he broke. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so that was a big media blowout, and that sort of stopped the Clipper that stopped the Clipper chip in a way. And so they were sort of the activist group of the crypto wars.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look back at that. And so, listeners, when you go and watch the Cypherpunks Write Code documentary series by Jim Epstein of Reason, you'll see some of that material presented. And I think it's also interesting as well, because I believe there's also there's an interview with the late Tim May, and I think he gets asked this question of, hey, what if this technology is used for bad things, right? I think his answer on that point was more like, look, I understand that some people might use technology for bad things, but this technology is out there, and fundamentally it's about liberation and using it for good. And despite knowing that, yes, sometimes you have to just bite the bullet, and there will be some bad people out there. So I think that might be an interesting perspective for listeners on this show, just to understand where they were coming from. That, look, sometimes technology can be used for bad things, but on net, if it's doing a good thing, it's a tool, it's a neutral tool, then that's the way to think about it.
Yeah, Tim May was very blunt, even, I would say, about that. Honest. He wasn't pretending that these tools of cryptography would only bring nice, rainbowy, flowery things into the world. It would also help extortionists, and it would also, there would be downsides, and that is true. And yeah, it was always, more than anyone else, probably, it was very direct and straightforward about that, and not trying to mince words or trying to hide the more negative aspects of it.
Yeah, excellent. And so, moving on to Bitcoin and some of the predecessor technologies of Bitcoin, I think this is another one where people think, and so the common analogy I'm sure a lot of people have heard is they say, oh, but what if Bitcoin is the MySpace and there's some new thing coming and that's going to be the Facebook? And I think it's important to recognize that Bitcoin itself was not the MySpace, if you will, that there were all these preceding technologies. It's 30 or 40 years of other technologies, and some of the three or four in particular that are very, if you will, influential on Bitcoin, or it's very clear that Bitcoin either drew some influence from those, or even if it was coincidental, that it had very similar technologies around that. So Aaron, do you want to just talk a little bit to that point, that there were some of these other technologies preceding Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I already mentioned eCash, although I didn't mention that it was called eCash, I think. But that was David Chaum's thing that he was working on in Amsterdam, the digital cash system that was centralized, that had patent issues, and the cypherpunks started to look for something else. Now, the big breakthrough, I would say, was when Adam Back came up with the idea of Hashcash. Hashcash was originally designed as a sort of a postage scheme. So I mentioned remailers. That was the tools you used to be able to email anonymously. Cypherpunks were running these kinds of remailer servers, and they were dealing with a lot of spam. People were abusing these systems. So they were thinking of some sort of solution to counter that, and Adam Beck came up with the idea of Hashcash. And the idea was that you'd basically take the email and then hash it. Well, yeah, so you take the email and you hash it, which is, a cryptographic algorithm that parses the data into just a string of numbers, essentially. It looks random, but every time you hash the same email, it's the same exact string of numbers. But you can't predict what it's going to be. Now, by adding some random data to these emails, you get a different string of numbers each time, a different hash. And the idea behind Hashcash was that only a very small subset of all potential hashes would be considered valid. So the only way to get a valid hash was through trial and error. Just try hashing the email with some new random data until you get a valid hash. When you get a valid hash, you send it to the recipient, and the recipient could very easily tell that the hash was valid. Now, the reason this worked as a postage system was because the sender of an email had to invest a little bit of energy, to do the hashing, just a little bit of computing power in order to find a valid hash. For an individual user, this is negligible. Maybe it's a second of your computer's CPU or something. But if you're a spammer and you're only profitable if you're able to send millions of emails, then it's going to add up, and it's probably not going to be profitable anymore, because now you got to make millions of hashes, and it's a lot of energy and computing power. Now, the interesting thing about Hashcash, even though it was intended as a postage scheme like I just described, was that now for the first time you tied something scarce in the real world into something digital that you can send over the internet. The scarce thing being energy, and the digital thing in that case obviously being the proof of work. That's what it's called, the proof of work. Other cypherpunks realized that, hey, this is maybe very interesting to also use as sort of the basis for a digital cash system. So in that case, the logic becomes a little bit like gold, in the same way that, the only way to get gold is to actually invest energy. In gold's case, you have to invest the energy to get it out of the ground. So the cypherpunks started to think of Hashcash as a potential basis for a digital cash system, as a digital goals type of system, and that's how Nick Szabo came up with the system called BitGold. And BitGold used the Hashcash in the way I just described, and now tied it to accounts. So you could earn some Hashcash, not Hashcash, so you could earn some BitGold by investing proof of work, and at that point you sort of owns that BitGold, and you can send it to other people. At that point, okay, so it gets far more complicated. It gets much more complicated very fast, because now you're dealing with all sorts of other problems. For example, who's keeping track of who owns which piece of BitGold? That's one problem. Szabo suggested a system where users would keep. Am I saying that right? Yeah, Szabo had sort of a layered system where there would be like banks that would collect. Well, they would keep track of who owns what. I think individuals could do it as well. Another problem is that it gets cheaper and cheaper each year. Computers get faster each year, right? So each year that goes by, it becomes easier to generate a valid piece of, whether it's Hashcash or BitGold, gets cheaper each year. So if you use that as the basis for a money system, they're going to have to deal with a lot of inflation eventually, which is not a good property for money. So that was a problem they were dealing with. What else? Well, let me elaborate a little bit more on the ownership part of it. This is actually... Okay, let me address something else, because this is also interesting. So this is not a digital cash system, but it is mentioned in the Bitcoin white paper. And I think it's a relevant technology, which is timestamping. So two guys also in the 90s, they weren't really cypherpunks, but Scott Ternetta and Stuart Haber, they were trying, they wanted to invent some solution to create digital timestamps, which is meant to say that they wanted people to prove that a particular document existed at a particular time. Now that turned out to actually be a fairly difficult problem to solve because, first of all, digital documents, you, they're, you can very easily edit them always. You can never tell how old they are. So how are you actually going to be able to tell how old the document is? Now, an obvious solution is to, use sort of a timestamp server. But at that point, you're trusting the server not to lie. If you ask the server, hey, how old is this document? The server could potentially lie to you. So it had a centralized point of failure, central point of failure. The solution they eventually came up with was, okay, we're gonna use this timestamp server to timestamp documents, but we're all gonna keep track of which documents were timestamped when, in order, for example. That way, the timestamp server can never lie because we're all keeping track of it. So that was, it sounds very simple now, but it was actually a pretty big insight that in order to not have to trust anyone, we need to all verify it ourselves. We need to all partake in this process of keeping track what came before the other thing. And that was eventually used in digital cash systems, including Bitcoin, but also something like White-Eye's B-Money, which also used this logic of everyone's just going to keep track of everything that's happening. Everyone's going to keep track of everything that everyone owns. I forgot what your question was at this point.
Yeah, no,
Stephan.
that's totally fine. I think that was really good background and information on some of the preceding technologies behind Bitcoin. And I think it might also be worthwhile pointing out as well that these are, from a technological point of view, some of the predecessors, but arguably as well some of the other even businesses and ideas. Things like PayPal and Liberty Reserve and Liberty Dollar and some of these other ideas that were around, and then eventually those got shut down because ultimately they weren't. And that sort of brings us back to this same theme of having to have a money that's actually decentralized in order for it to be resilient. And I think that also comes through.
eGold is the best example of that. eGold was a solution also by sort of a libertarian guy. I think he was in Florida. Douglas Jackson, I think his name was. I could be getting the name wrong, but I think that's what his name was. He was running sort of a gold, a gold-backed digital currency, so people could own gold, and then all the gold would be in his vault. He'd have the gold in his vault, but people could get this gold through this digital currency. They could exchange the currency for the gold. It was backed by gold. And this digital currency could then be used to send it to anyone on the internet, easy, like an email. And that system was eventually shut down, and Douglas Jackson was put on house arrest. He had like an ankle brace, and he couldn't. So yeah, the feds got to him, and I think eGold users eventually got their money back, their gold. But yeah, the company was shut down, and it made it obvious that centralized systems are vulnerable in that sense.
Yeah, of course. And then, so if we now move forward to Satoshi, right? So in 2008, Satoshi releases the white paper, and I guess at that time, it was. What was the reception amongst people at that time of Satoshi's Bitcoin white paper?
It was pretty mixed. There was a lot of skepticism, and I think that was in large part because there had been all these digital cash projects before it that never really got off the ground. And a lot of, well, I don't know about a lot, but several of the cypherpunks had grown disillusioned altogether. They thought the movement hadn't achieved what it set out to do, although they had some successes. But one of the things they never achieved was a digital cash system. So then all of a sudden this totally unknown name appears on the mailing list, and he comes up with yet another digital cash system that sort of resembles some stuff that's been out there already. And it probably makes sense that if you've been around that long and you've seen so many failures, you're not immediately going to be excited about some unknown guy coming up, presenting something that you kind of have seen before and never really worked out. So yeah, most of the people I'd say by then it was the cryptography mailing list, the cypherpunk mailing list that basically I think it was technically still online, but everyone had left and that becomes spammy and flame war-y. And so the cypherpunks that were still serious about getting these kinds of tools into the world, they sort of switched to the cryptography mailing list, and that's where Satoshi Nakamoto published the white paper. So yeah, most of them were skeptical. Now, of course, I think what you're getting at, there was a one obvious exception to that rule, which was Hal Finney. Hal Finney was also a digital cash pioneer. He'd also been working on that stuff since the early 90s, thinking of all sorts of always helping out with digital cash schemes, always trying to brainstorm of how they could be improved, or trying to explain to other cypherpunks on the mailing list how particular schemes worked or what the potential trade-offs were. He was very involved with all of that. Also in 2005, 4 or 5, I think it was 2005, he he launched his own digital cash scheme, which was a sort of simplified version of Nick Szabo's BitGold. Very simplified. It was called reusable proof of work, which was, a hash cash system, but more based on a central server that kept track of ownership of the money. He had some extra tools to minimize trust in him, but Hal Finney, he hadn't given up. Clearly, he was still interested and excited about digital cash stuff. So when Satoshi came to the mailing list, made his proposal, Hal Finney was one of the few that actually seemed excited about it, and he started to help Satoshi out in the months that followed until Satoshi released Bitcoin on January 9th.
Yeah, so January 2009, and then I think Hal Finney was the next person to join Satoshi on the network. And I think famously the first transaction was from Satoshi to Hal Finney.
Yeah, I don't think we can be sure that he was the first next person, although it's plausible. But he was definitely the first recipient of a transaction. Yeah.
Right, I see.
And the first contributor to code besides Satoshi. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think in those early days, and this is before both you and I were around. This is like you and I very we only kind of get around into this scene later, and so I think it's also maybe an interesting point just to talk about how Bitcoin in the early days is far more centralized, and it's kind of decentralized over time, right? Wouldn't you say?
Well, when Bitcoin launched, it was probably one person running it. So one person mining, one person developing, well, or two, I guess. So that's pretty centralized. Yeah, I think maybe what you're getting at more specifically is centralization of protocol development in a way. Yeah, I think in the first couple of years, Satoshi was still around, and he was considered, the project leader, and most people accepted him as the project leader. So when it was time for some sort of upgrades, then that was just Satoshi deciding we're gonna update the protocol in this way or another, and please everyone download this new version. And that was basically that was it. He was kind of the dictator in that sense. That started to crumble a little bit, I would say, towards Satoshi's later days. So that's like late 2010-ish. He was starting to receive a little bit of pushback on some aspects. So yeah, and so yeah, you could see that as that's when Bitcoin started to decentralize. I think you you could see it that way.
Yeah. And
At least in that
yeah.
sense. I mean, to be clear, there's all sorts of ways you can measure decentralization, whether it's, are people able to run nodes, are they able to mine, how many people are mining. But when it comes to protocol development, at first there was just Satoshi, and that evolved later on.
Yeah. And it's also, I guess, important to note that in terms of ownership, it's still another story altogether, right? Like people can still own it, even if, it's somebody else developing it, right? So that was at least some of the, if you will, the guarantees that Bitcoin gives to people, that if they hold their private keys, they still hold the Bitcoins, and that kind of thing. So I wanted to move forward now to some of the, I guess, instructional moments in Bitcoin's history, right? So I think probably the big one is probably the Segwit UASF, and then the Segwit 2x kind of saga, if you will. So it might be a good time to just talk through a little bit of the history now in terms of what happened with that, everything coming to a head in 2017. What were some of the, I guess, preceding historical factors there?
Well, where would you like to start, Stefan?
Yeah, so let's start with
we both know it's a long story.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So maybe if we spoke a little bit about maybe how the network had been growing and being adopted at that time. So I think maybe I'll start with a little bit. So it was, I think Bitcoin in 2013 was really crazy, right? Like it was like really out there. And at the time, there was this whole idea of merchant adoption, right? So it was all about trying to get people some merchant to accept payment in Bitcoin. And so there was very much this idea that, and yes, there were Bitcoin exchanges and various software brokers and things like that. And so there were a lot of transactions on the chain. And now there was, I guess, competing visions about how Bitcoin should develop. And there were some people who had a business model based on doing day-to-day transactions in Bitcoin. And then from a competing point of view, there was more like this view that, see, the network needs to be resilient and robust against attacks, and it needs to be easy for anyone to be able to run Bitcoin software. Whereas maybe people in that other camp were more thinking, hey, we need to be able to, anyone needs to be able to send cheaply and quickly. And don't worry so much about running a Bitcoin node. You don't need to do that anyway. So I guess that was probably some of the initial tension. What do you have anything to add there on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good description, and that's also, I agree, that's also a good place to start. Is that at some point Bitcoin was small enough that everyone, was sort of on the same page, or if they weren't, it wasn't obvious yet. But there were sort of two different visions of what people wanted Bitcoin to be, or what they thought Bitcoin was, or what Bitcoin's value proposition was. And these can be roughly divided into people who saw Bitcoin as, or maybe still see Bitcoin more as a payment system first, and people who see it more, as a digital gold and as a robust thing first that should be able to withstand even government attacks, and that people need to be able to feel secure in when they store their value into that system. So these were two sort of differing visions, and while these existed side by side for a while, it started to crack a little bit. Again, it depends where you want to start. You could argue even in 2010, Satoshi didn't really leave one clear vision behind. It was sort of both there, and you can look through all of his comments and quotes and cherry pick here and there, and then you'll find something that suggests he agreed with you. But my general impression is that he hadn't really thought it through to that extent, and so yeah, the cracks sort of started happening. There was a short discussion in 2010 when one of the Bitcoin developers at that time wanted to. So yeah, it comes down to the block size limit, right? We haven't mentioned that, I think, but yeah. So the Bitcoin protocol has a limit on the size of blocks. So I think people by now will know that a block is found every 10 minutes. And at some point, Satoshi limited the size of blocks to 1 megabyte. Now, one of the big advantages of that is, for example, that by limiting the size of blocks, that ensures that everyone can, or at least that it's relatively easy to run a full node. If you're running a full node, you're validating all of the protocol rules. So, for example, you're validating that there are, in fact, only 21 million Bitcoins. If you can't validate all the protocol rules, then you're not really sure what's actually going on. So that's one of the big advantages of this block size limit. There are others, but fee pressure is another one, and mining decentralization. But so it helps the robustness of the network, I would say. Now, it's not very good though if you see Bitcoin as a payment processor first, because now all of a sudden you can only have like a handful of transactions every second, and if you compare that to successful payment systems, they're probably doing thousands, 10,000s if you look at Visa or PayPal or these kinds of systems. So if you want to compete with that, you definitely need to increase the block size limit. So that's that. So that these different visions sort of clashed on this one protocol limit, which was the block size limit, the protocol rule called the block size limit. Now, so it started sort of in 2010, I guess, that people started to discuss it. Then there was an upsurge in the discussion in 2013 as well. And at that point, it became clear that there were actually people in the community, in the Bitcoin world, with very different visions. This lingered for a little while longer until in 2015, the previous Bitcoin Core lead developer, Gavin Andreessen, decided that it was actually really time to increase the block size limits. Now, this revealed another very interesting problem. So we just discussed these two visions. Now, the new interesting problem that people were starting to consider very seriously at this point is, okay, if there are different visions, then how are we moving forward? Who's in charge here? Gavin Andreessen, he believes that miners were in charge, that miners could effectively change the rules by producing a longer blockchain that enforced these new rules, and then Bitcoin users would sort of have to follow that blockchain now, because that was now Bitcoin. While other people figured, no, that doesn't make any sense. The rules are what's being enforced locally, and then miners are just following these rules. So if miners would produce a blockchain, even if it has more hash power, but it's breaking the rules, then they're just producing something that's not Bitcoin, because the rules are enforced locally by users. This became, and I'm not even getting into the role of developers, which some people would consider that maybe developers are designing the rules. Now this led to what is called the block size war, essentially. So people were, it became a big fight in the Bitcoin community. Gavin Andreessen and Mike Hearn, they at some point launched a client that was supposed to increase the block size limit through what is called a hard fork. So, they would split the chain, and then they would assume that if miners mine the longer chain, then users will just switch to it. Miners never did that, so that never happened. Then there were a couple of other attempts. Now, in the meantime, the Bitcoin Core developers, they came up with a pretty clever protocol upgrade that was intended as a compromise. So that was called Segwit. Now, Segwit would increase the block size a bit, but would do it in a way without necessarily splitting the chain. So they figured out a way to keep the network together and increase the block size a bit. As a very, well, actually as the main benefit, the block size limit was sort of an additional benefit. As the main benefit, it also fixed a flaw in the Bitcoin protocol. You could call it a flaw, at least. It's a bit technical, but by fixing this flaw, the Bitcoin protocol would be able to support the Lightning Network. The Lightning Network would be able to allow users to transact off-chain. So they could still use Bitcoin as a payment system, cheap and fast transactions without requiring all their transactions to be included in the block. So the block size limit wouldn't have to be increased, at least not in the near term, so to say. So the Bitcoin core developers came up with this idea, but even that didn't please both sides. The side that wanted bigger blocks still wanted a hard fork. I don't know why. That was something they were very committed to do it through a hard fork, and this ultimately led to a stalemate where. Okay, so this new protocol rule I just mentioned, Segwit. Since Satoshi left, the way new protocol rules were activated was through hash power coordination. By having a majority of hash power miners enforce the new rules, you would guarantee that the chain wouldn't split. I just mentioned that great benefit. So that's a great benefit. It does require that miners activate the new rules. So they were starting to use hash power activation for upgrades, and they wanted to use that for Segwit as well. Miners, however, or at least some big miners, they wanted to hard fork. They wanted the other way of upgrading the protocol. So because of that, they refused to deploy and activate. They refused to activate Segwit, and they were sort of using it as a, something to bargain with. They wanted to hard. They were trying to leverage their influence, so to say, on protocol development. So this caused a stalemate. Now that led to so the stalemate lasted for a while, and at that point we get to the UESF, which you just mentioned, Stephan. So yeah, so the UESF was a very interesting idea, and it was the idea that it was sort of it was users reminding themselves, remembering that miners were ultimately just activating the new rules. They weren't actually making the rules. They were just activating the new rules. So if if users could figure out an alternative way to activate the new rules, these would just be the new rules. When they are the new rules, miners will definitely have to follow because that's how they make money. Now there is a pretty easy alternative way to activate rules. Namely, you just pick a date and you agree this is the day the new rules are going to be enforced. Okay. What happens next is, to this day, contentious. There's still a lot of disagreements on how Segwit ultimately was activated. Do we want to get into that, Livera?
Maybe we just sort of talk through high level. I think probably the important point is more just that it's like, just to explain that there are different parties in this ecosystem, right? You've got developers who can write code, but they can't force anyone to run that code. That's an important thing, because ultimately it means developers aren't this kind of dictator person, because if nobody likes that code, nobody will run that code. On the other hand, you've got miners, and they help secure the network, but they fundamentally do not determine what Bitcoin is. And then you have businesses in the space, and some of them at that time were purporting to represent the interests of their users. But in reality, that was not necessarily true, that there may be a lot of users who did not agree with the position that business was taking. And then fundamentally, you have users, the ones who are actually running a Bitcoin node. And those are the ones who arguably have, at the end of the day, they have the most sway. They have the most power at the end of the day. It's not 100% all in their favor, because miners still are securing the chain for the users. But in terms of, I would explain it like the users are the ones who determine where the value is. Because if you are a miner, a big risk for you is that you end up mining on a chain that has no value. And that's a big problem for you because you've invested a lot in terms of capital expenditure and operating expenditure to maintain your operations, that you're very reliant on what the user wants. And so I think for me, the important lesson that perhaps new people to Bitcoin should understand is that despite a lot of businesses, despite stated there being a lot of hash power that wanted a certain thing, it didn't necessarily go that way, did it?
It didn't, yeah, and I agree with your assessment there. I think that's exactly right. It's ultimately users, and by users, I would say the people that are willing to accept Bitcoin, in trade, whether it's for payment or whether it's they're just selling their dollars, so to say, and buying Bitcoin in that sense, and willing to hold on to it. That's ultimately what gives Bitcoin value, and therefore it's ultimately what determines what Bitcoin is. It's a bit it gets a bit weird, but I think the best analogy I would give for that is language. Who determines the English language? Well, it's people using it. That's who, and that's also how it evolves. So I would sort of describe, that's how I sort of think of Bitcoin. And in Bitcoin, there's more economic incentives at play, and it's if you're accepting a lot of payments, then you're a bit more important in that sense. But yeah, it's a network effect, and it's sort of an organic thing there. So yeah, it's developers are offering codes, but users can always just not run the code. So I don't think they're in power. Miners, they can hash all they want, but if they're not hashing into something that users consider to be Bitcoin, then they're just wasting their hash power. So miners are clearly not in charge in that sense, although they can order transactions. That's what they're doing. And I don't think businesses are ultimately that important either. If you because sometimes people think exchanges are very important when it comes to dividing Bitcoin or value in Bitcoin, but I don't really see it that way. If you go out and you want to buy a Tesla, and you get to the car dealership and you ask for a Tesla, and they say, "Hey, we only have Hondas," you're not gonna go home with a Honda. You're just gonna look for another car dealership. So it's ultimately users, it's the markets that decide these things.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I think the language one is a good analogy. And a similar in other spheres, I've heard it put this way. It's sort of like, imagine Merriam-Webster dictionary came out and defined up as down. Would that mean up has now changed? Well, no. We as users of the English language would be like, that's the wrong definition. That's just not right. It would be kind of like if the developers or if the miners tried to redefine things in a way that the users did not agree with, would be say, hang on, that's just the wrong definition. That's not what we believe is Bitcoin. So maybe that's an easy way to kind of summarize some of these pieces together. And of course, listeners who are if you're going through the course material, you'll see some of Aaron's work on this. So he wrote an article, and there was also a really good YouTube video by the Bitcoin Magazine team, which you guys can find. You can find the material there on the site, and basically that's Aaron's kind of walking through of the story of Segwit and UASF.
So let me actually finish that, because we haven't mentioned how it actually ended. So how it actually ended is that at some point, this started really as a grassroots movement. It started with an idea on the mailing list. Then some people gathered on an open Slack system, a Slack chat, and they started to think of this idea called the UASF. And the idea was that, hey, you know what? We're the users. We decide the rules. So what we're going to do to break this impasse, because the miners weren't activating Segwit and we all want Segwit, you know what we're going to do? We're going to activate Segwit ourselves, and we're going to pick a date. The date is going to be August 1st. That was the date. Now, the way the USF worked, so like I said, it's just picking a date. On this date, these are the new protocol rules. This is now that on that date, that's what we're going to be considering to be Bitcoin. At that point, miners are going to have to mine these rules, or else they're not mining Bitcoin in our view, and we're the users. And they're not going to get paid if they don't do that, so they don't really have a choice. They're just going to have to follow along and mind these new rules. And then we've switched to the new protocol rules. We've upgraded the protocol rules. So that was the plan. The tricky thing is, and that's where the contention still comes from today, is that how do you know for sure that all users are going to switch, or that enough users are going to switch, or that, because we don't have a good way of measuring that. Or I would argue we actually have a pretty good way we figured out a pretty good way later, and I'll get to that in a minute. But we didn't really have a good way of measuring that back then. It was just people on, first on the mailing list and then on Slack, and later it became a big thing on social media, and everyone was sort of, anticipating this day and claiming that they would use these new rules, and there was everyone on Twitter and everyone on Reddit. But then the contention still today is how many people are actually on Twitter and Reddit? Like, what kind of fraction is this of that, the greater Bitcoin user base? That's sort of an unknown. So maybe it was a very small group of people, and maybe they would have essentially just forked themselves off the network, or maybe it was really what it looked like was a lot of people, and a lot of people were, engaged with this and they wanted to do it. We in retrospect, we can't know for sure. And one of the reasons we can't know for sure is that basically miners folded. They conceded. A week before the actual date was about to happen, they ultimately upgraded the protocol through hash power themselves. One thing I have left out so far is that there was also the business faction. They were at that point also pushing for Segwit. And they also struck a deal with the miners to activate Segwit. So all of this happened very last minute, just ahead of the USF, and therefore Segwit activated without, arguably without the USF really coming into play. Although, you might as well say it happened because of the USF was just about to get into play, and that's, it worked perfectly. So these are sort of different perspectives. Now, the reason companies and miners ultimately conceded, apart from the USF itself, was that businesses struck a deal with miners that if they would activate Segwit, they would also get a hard fork 3 months later. Now, that was a deal between businesses and miners, and we just mentioned 4 groups, essentially, which was miners, businesses, developers, and users. So the developers or users weren't part of that deal at all. So that basically got us into a whole new phase of the war, last phase of the war, I would say, where miners and companies were still expecting to do this hard fork, where users, at least the users you could see on Twitter and Reddit overall, and developers, they had no appetite for the hard fork. They had Segwit, they had Lightning, they were happy. They didn't want this hard fork. They didn't care about this deal that miners made with businesses. So this got us into a new interesting situation where, who's in power here? On the one hand, we have all of the hash power in the world, basically, all of these miners, all of their equipment, and the largest Bitcoin companies in the world, the Coinbases, the whoever else they were. Surely if these 2 power groups are, coming together to make a deal, surely they're going to be able to change the protocol, right? What are a handful of developers and users going to do? Well, it turned out a lot. One of the interesting things that happened in that phase is that some exchanges start to recognize that there could actually be a chain split if that happened. Like I explained before, hard fork can lead to a chain split in that way. And they started to offer fork futures. So people could actually speculate on both coins. They could essentially buy the coins that would start to exist after the split would happen, even though the split hadn't happened yet. And now people could put their money where their mouth is and start to trade these coins with each other. While this fork futures thing, the market was going on, it became abundantly clear that the market favored, and I would say the market are the users, they favored the non-hard fork version of Bitcoin, just the protocol.
Yeah, the no 2x, right?
Exactly. So while all of these companies and all of these miners wanted to go another way, it now became clear that users did not want that. And as the date came closer and closer of the hard fork, and the price wasn't moving, the futures market were being very clear. The developers weren't about to concede at all. And at some point, the miners and companies just had to fold. So that gets me back to what I mentioned of the Tesla dealer and the Honda dealer. Ultimately, it's the market, it's the users that are in power of this thing, that are in control of this thing. So it was a very interesting and I would say empowering moment for users. It was really the realization of a lot of users that yes, they really do decide the rules here. It really does matter what they're running on their computers and what they're willing to pay for or what they're willing to accept for payment. That is really what it is about in the end. It's not companies, it's not miners, it's not developers making these decisions. I'll add, it's not developers either, because we haven't really mentioned it, because most developers were against the UESF. So developers didn't get their way in the USF part of the story, and then companies and miners didn't get their way in the Node 2X part of the story. It's really users that sort of, showed and proved they were in control. There is still contention about how effective the UESF was. My personal opinion, given everything that happened, and I was paying a lot of attention, is that it had a lot of effect. Really, miners and companies were scrambling to sort of meet the deadline in absurd ways. There was no reason for them to scramble in that way if they didn't think the USF was going to be a meaningful thing that they had to fold to, had to concede to. So my personal opinion is that the USF was very effective, but that's still something that's not necessarily agreed on by everyone, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair summary of what happened, and you could potentially say it's like, even if UASF itself didn't activate it, as you were saying, it's almost maybe this is a bad way to characterize it, or some people would agree with it. They might say it was almost like playing a game of chicken, and essentially the users had sort of forced the other side to change, to swerve, right? So maybe that's one way to characterize it. Or another view is more just like, no, the users are just the ones who changed their view of the network, and everyone else needs to adapt to what those users view it as. But I think, importantly, looking back on those events now, I think it's important to take the lesson from that, which is ultimately that businesses and miners and developers do not control Bitcoin. And that was actually quite informative and instructive in the view of other people who then looked at that as an example of how Bitcoin is difficult to change. And that's ultimately an important lesson that we have to take going forward, because that, helped show people that it's not that there's this kind of dictator, or it is genuinely a decentralized ecosystem. And I think that's probably an important lesson to draw from that, as we speak now about it in 2021 and in the years to come. So look, I think
Bitcoin,
anything to add there? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin did change. We got Segwit. I think it's very difficult to change Bitcoin in ways that users don't want.
Of course. Yeah, exactly. I should have put it that way. So I think that's probably a good point to wrap up here. But Aaron, we've got to let all the listeners and the viewers know about any projects you've got coming up. I know you've got some work on this, and of course, where can they follow you online?
Yeah, so easiest would be Twitter, right? That's what everyone uses nowadays. So I'm at Aaron Van W. I am working on a book on this stuff, especially the prehistory part of it. So the cypherpunk stuff, it's gonna have a bunch of Austrian economics in there, and how these things were interwoven, previous digital cash projects. I hope to have that a little bit later this year. It should be finished.
Excellent. So listeners, I would encourage you to follow Aaron and check out some of his work. He's got a lot of cool articles, and he's got a podcast as well. So you guys can follow him there.
And like you mentioned, on Bitcoin Magazine, of course. Although because I'm busy with my book, I don't write as much there. But still, Bitcoin Magazine, I'm still on the team there.
Yep, of course. And so listeners and viewers, if you haven't already, make sure you go to Saylor Academy and search in the course, search Bitcoin. You'll see the course. It's called Bitcoin for Everybody. And there's all the material there. It's free. You can go through whenever you like. And of course, you guys can find me online. Search Stephan Livera, stephanlivera.com. And I'll hand it back over to Mike. Thank you.
All right. Well, Aaron and Stephan, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As always, Stephan, you take all of my plugs. I got no plugs, but definitely check out the Bitcoin for Everybody course on Saylor.org. You can go to Saylor Academy YouTube and find the videos we've done before. We've done 2 more videos, and you can come back here in 2 weeks, April 7th at 5 p.m. Well, I guess daylight savings time, which means that it's April 8th. 8 a.m. for you there, Stephan, which will update on the everything. We had a little miscommunication there, and yeah, so I think Michael Saylor is going to be joining us on that one. So people come around. I'm sure I put both of their links in the description below, as well as links to the course and everything. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and